So we are in about 2/3 of the way through this series about resetting our focus here at North Kinsey onto the process of growing mature followers of Jesus, what we call our 4G process, that we want people to grow in devotion to Jesus, to gather together as friends and family. We want to give our lives away in meaningful service, and especially, we want to go on mission with Jesus. And because we have a struggle, especially with this last one, we've expanded this fourth G about going on mission with this acrostic, blessed. Now, this blessed it's a new thing for me, but I really do like it. That we begin the process of sharing with prayer. And we pray that this person that we know, that we care about, that they will have the opportunity and the desire and the openness to hear about Jesus. We listen to people with love so that they feel like they've been heard. We eat together for fun and we're just friends together. We serve unselfishly. We share our story. And we disciple those that decide, I want to follow Jesus. They become our friends that we disciple, that we take responsibility for. And so we're looking at that first S today, that we serve unselfishly. And I want us to think about a well-known saying supposedly from Francis of Assisi, that goes, preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words. Now, there's no evidence that Francis ever said this, and generally the sayings that we do have that we know did come from Francis are longer and more precise. But there's truth in it, and unfortunately there's also people that misuse it. What I really appreciate about our blessed acrostic is that it emphasizes the importance of demonstrating the love of God by the life we live in front of our friends before we try to talk to them about Jesus. That sharing the gospel is a lot more than a speech about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. It begins with a demonstration, a long demonstration of God's love at work in our lives. So we've looked at the importance of praying, and that the person that we are praying for, that they'll be introduced to Jesus, they'll listen, that they'll have many opportunities to hear about him, and that we won't be the only ones that they know that are bringing them Jesus. That we are listening to them in love, and we are sharing with them around meals and in other times that are just for fun. So let's talk about what it means to be serving in an unselfish way. Next week we're going to talk about talking. And for us, many of us, that's the hard part, but it's also absolutely essential. So what our maybe Franciscan saying should say would be more like, proclaim the love of God always with our actions, and at the right time, use words. So to help us understand something about this idea of serving first, I want us to think about a church planting adventure that Paul had that's recorded in the book of Acts, in Acts 16. And today we're going to look at verses 23 to 34. But since we're kind of breaking into the middle of the story, I want to give you a little background. Paul and Silas and Timothy have traveled across what is now Turkey, and somehow the Spirit has been leading them to go west. And don't ask me how that worked, because I don't know. They get to the seacoast, and Paul has a dream that indicates to him, you need to go across the Aegean Sea from Asia into Europe to the northern part of Greece called Macedonia. And so they traveled to Macedonia, and the first city on the Roman road is the city of Philippi. And unlike most of the cities that the missionaries had been visiting, Philippi did not have a Jewish synagogue. This was the preferred place for Paul to start with the proclamation of the gospel. But they did find a prayer meeting outside of town, and they were able to share with the ladies that were meeting there. And one of them, a lady named Lydia, a wealthy merchant, became a Christian. And she insisted that Paul and his companions come and live with her. And they continued their work around Philippi. And while they were walking around town, this slave girl who was possessed by an occult spirit that gave her some power of clairvoyance began to follow them. And she was shouting, "These are servants of the Most High God, and they've come with message of salvation." And this went on for days. And Paul became distressed for the girl and became tired of this spirit that was acting as their unwanted herald. And so he turned to the girl and he cast that spirit out of her, even though he knew that this was likely going to result in some uproar. And it did. The slave girl's owners had made a good income from this girl who was good at telling fortunes, had a reputation for knowing what the future was going to bring. And so they grabbed Paul and Silas and they dragged them before the city judges, and they accused them of advocating foreign customs that were hostile to Roman culture. And since they were Jews, and since there was a great deal of anti-Semitism in the Roman Empire, they soon had a crowd that was crying for their blood, and the judges were only too happy to have them stripped and beaten there in the center of town, and then handed them over to the city jailer for safekeeping. So that's where we take up our text today. We're going to read from Acts 16, and we're going to read verses 23 to 34. After Paul and Silas had been severely beaten, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. Upon receiving such orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundation of the prison was shaken. And at once all the prison doors flew open, and everybody's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." The jailer called for lights and rushed in and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out, and he asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and you'll be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all others in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds, and then immediately he and all his family were baptized. The jailer brought them to his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole family. So we're talking about this idea that we need to begin with this demonstration of God's love before we look for the opportunity to share the gospel. And we see this in Paul's example here in Philippi. Paul was not somebody who wanted to stand on the street corners and shout at people about the good news. And he didn't want this slave girl to stand on the street corners and shout at people on his behalf either. And so he decided, I've got to help this girl. She's in bondage to this spirit. And realizing it was going to be a problem, he still cast the spirit out. After he and Silas were put in prison and they put their legs in stocks, which probably got them into a very uncomfortable posture, they began to sing. Now, for me, I would have been complaining loudly about injustice and police brutality, and maybe I'd gotten very sulky and quiet, but they began to sing and praise God. And the other prisoners are listening. They're interested. And I think probably the jailer was aware of this as well. In the middle of the night, God sends an earthquake, and it shakes that jail wide open. The jailer, when he sees that the doors are open, assumes that his prisoners had escaped and that he was going to be held responsible by his superior officers, and they were probably going to execute him and perhaps torture him first. And so, desiring to escape that public humiliation and the pain, he prepares to commit suicide. And Paul anticipates that this might be his reaction, and he cries out, "Don't do it. We're here. We're still here. Don't hurt yourself." Now, I think this jailer was an intelligent man. He was an officer in the army. He was not a fool. He undoubtedly knew something about why Paul and Silas had come to Philippi. He probably knew something about those that were already beginning to listen to the gospel that Paul was sharing. He knew about what had happened to that slave girl and her being freed from possession. He had heard the singing. He saw the power of God to rescue his spokesman. And now he has experienced mercy from Paul, who prevents him from hurting himself. And so he comes to Paul and he asks him, "Please tell me about how I can have this salvation that I've been hearing about." The demonstration of God's love, if it's clearly visible, like it was here in Paul's life, it'll have a profound effect, just like it had on this jailer. He wanted what Paul had. And if our neighbors experience God's love from us, they will want what we've got. The nonverbal testimony is in our lives, and it will open the door for our neighbors to want to know, why are you like this? Why do you care about me? And this is exactly what it says in 1 Peter 3:15. In your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope you have, but with gentleness and respect. And I want to just underline the idea that very often, if we are proclaiming the gospel with our actions, if we're proclaiming God's love with our actions, we won't have to initiate the conversation about Jesus. People will come and ask us, "I want to know why you are the way you are." Paul had been proclaiming the love of God with his actions, and now at the right time he began to use words. And he explained to the jailer and his family how Jesus had come from God to offer people who followed him a way to come back into relationship with the Father. As they understood the importance of trusting God and following Jesus, Paul challenges them to demonstrate that trust by being baptized into Christ. And while the Acts account doesn't say anything about it, I'm pretty sure Paul also made every effort to connect the jailer and his family with the church that was beginning there in Philippi, because it's quite impossible to be a Lone Ranger Christian. Now, in the last 75 years, there's been a new branch of practical ministry studies that focuses on how God's people are to take the gospel into places where it's never been, where there's even resistance to it. We call this missiology. And at several times we've mentioned the idea that in many ways Oregon is a mission field. About 9 out of 10 of our neighbors never go to church. Many of them know very little about Jesus. He's a swear word to them. And they can be very hostile even to the church. And so we are going to have a little lesson today. In our school, little school in South Africa, I taught Introduction to Missions. And so you get a little lesson today. Now, I'm not going to ask how many remember Cartesian planes from algebra. I'm sure you remember them with great fondness if you do. This great matrix uses the Cartesian plane to help us visualize what needs to happen in order for someone who doesn't know much about Jesus and is hostile to the church to finally hear the gospel. And we have two axes. The y-axis has to do with the knowledge of Jesus, and down at the bottom it says knows nothing about the gospel. And up at the top it says able to teach others. And so it's a process of learning. The person moves from an initial contact with the gospel to a deeper grasp of the gospel generally, and then specifically how it applies to them, and finally comes to a place where they decide, I need to follow Jesus. And that's when that axis crosses the 0 point and becomes positive. And then this describes the growth of the disciple, who is incorporated into the body and grows to understand God's will. He is devoted to following the Lord. He's devoted to the health of the local family of God. He's willing to treat life's resources as coming from God for the kingdom. And he's committed to become a disciple maker. And one of our greatest challenges is that, especially this is true of us that have followed Jesus for so long, is that we have developed a religious vocabulary that's very specialized. And we have trouble communicating with people that don't know much about Jesus, don't know much about the Bible, don't have much church background. Words like grace and salvation have little meaning to people that are unchurched. And words like love and freedom have a meaning for them, but it may be very different than how it's used here in the New Testament. I refer to this specialized vocabulary as our Protestant Latin. And we need to figure out, how do we talk to unchurched neighbors without using all this Christian lingo? And it is hard. It's challenging. So if we don't do that, what happens is that we have a message for people that have been churched in the past and are no longer committed to the Lord, but we have very little opportunity to talk to people that have never had any contact with the Lord or with the church. We're going to talk about that more next week. This morning we want to talk about that x-axis, which has to do with attitude. And the left side, the negative side, represents antagonism, or at least indifference to the gospel. And this antagonism and this indifference, very often we're part of the cause. We've not presented a consistent, positive witness to God's love. But in fact, our world is very hostile to Christ and the gospel. The devil himself is busy doing everything he can to drag people left in terms of their attitude, and want to keep them ignorant as well. He wants them in the lower left corner if possible. And so in that picture of the graph, there was a purple spot in the lower left corner. That's a person or a group that doesn't know much about the Lord, and he doesn't have a happy attitude or a positive attitude toward the church and the gospel. And our challenge then is, how do we reach down into that lower left corner and pull those people to a place where they can hear the gospel positively and respond positively to Christ? Paul had shown us something about this. His concern for all these strangers that he met in Philippi, including that possessed girl and the jailer, had brought the jailer to wanting to know, what is it you've got? Our blessed acrostic points out that our initial challenge is always to change hostility or indifference to the Lord from our neighbors into something that is positive about the gospel. I want what you've got. Now, this service that we offer to our neighbor must always be, can be almost anything. What really matters is two things. One, that it meets a need they feel they have. And this is really important. The second one is that we do it without any selfish motive. Now, this idea of felt need is really important. We can look at a situation and we can think, what this person really needs is ABC. But when they're standing in their position, what they feel they need is XYZ. And we can do ABC for them, and they're not going to have a very positive response, because what they really feel they need is something different. So suppose we meet someone on a Friday evening who's just landed out on the street. He doesn't have any resources. He doesn't understand what he needs to do to get by. Now, we know a group that helps people that are homeless, and they're just the sort of people that could help this person. But they're not going to be in the office until Monday morning. And so we write their name on a piece of paper and their phone number, and we hand it to the person and we walk off. Will that person feel loved and served? If we say, let me see if I can get you a place to sleep and get you something to eat, and on Monday I'll take you around to see these people. They're the ones that really know how to help. Then those people are going to feel served. They're going to feel blessed. Here's somebody that really cares about me. In both cases, we were actually giving the long-term solution, this group that knows what they're doing. But in the first instance, we've ignored this person's immediate need, his felt need, and we haven't done anything to help him right now in the situation he feels he's in. Now, the key to this kind of service is what the New Testament calls compassion. It's understanding what the person is feeling. It's walking a mile in their shoes. It's feeling their pain with them. It's what led the Samaritan to stop when he saw that man in the ditch on the Jericho road. He asked himself, if I were in the ditch on the Jericho road, what would I want this man with the donkey to do for me? I'd want him to stop and to get me out of here. And that's exactly what the Samaritan did. It's what moved the father when he saw his prodigal son coming down the road looking like he had been utterly defeated by life, and he had been. Caused him to run to grab that boy and hug him and kiss him. It was what that boy needed. So we begin with prayer, and we listen to our neighbor and with love, and we hear what they feel they need. And if possible, we try to help them with that. And we might even find out if they were willing to have some help from other people, because we have friends that would help too. Because the more Christian love they are exposed to, the better the witness. And then it's foundational, or we need to recognize that while the foundational need that our neighbor has maybe something he really needs to deal with. Maybe he's abusing substances, or maybe he's got a habit of being dishonest. And that's really what he needs to deal with. But that may not be what he's feeling right now. We need to help with the felt need, and also open the opportunity to talk about how do we work with some of these other more serious foundational problems. When we serve our neighbor, it needs to be in ways that seem meaningful to them. And that's just easy. Now, our motive is also very important. Last week, Neil shared about a dinner invitation from folks that wanted to recruit the Johnstons into their part-time business. And I really resonated with that. I had a couple such wonderful invitations in my younger years, and they were the most unwelcome things I'd ever had. But our selfishness can really show in other ways. We try to offer help that doesn't require us to sacrifice anything, and that becomes really apparent pretty quick. People aren't dumb, and they see he's trying to just blow me off here. We decide we'll give somebody something so they'll just go away and leave us alone. And that's selfish. When our main interest is at hoping that people will notice what we're doing. Jesus calls us being a hypocrite. Our neighbors need to feel that we are reaching out to them in love because we truly care about them. And if they have if they sense anything else, including that we want to have the right to give them our gospel spiel, then we're not going to have that effect of bringing them into a positive place with regards to the gospel. So when it comes to loving service to our neighbors, whether they are brothers or sisters, our friends that we're praying for, or maybe they're just somebody we met just now, we do have a clear command from Jesus. He tells us exactly how we are to respond to this person. It's found in Luke 31, and it's not hard to understand. It is real hard to live by. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Christ's followers have long called this the golden rule. We understand this summarizes well the concept of giving ourselves away in meaningful, unselfish service. Who do you know that needs to meet the Lord? Are you praying for them, for their well-being? Are you praying that the witness of the gospel is touching them from a lot of different places? Are you praying for that opportunity when you get a chance to share? Are you making time for conversation with them? Are you moving it toward a deeper level where you can really listen to their hearts, listen to how they're feeling? Are you making opportunities to eat together for fun? This is how we would like to be treated, and this is how we are called to treat every person. And we become friends with our neighbors that need the gospel, that we're praying for, who we're listening to, who we're enjoying a deeper fellowship with. And then we need to look at their situation. If I was in this person's shoes, what would I want? What would I need? What would I see as my big problem? And then we help them with that. We offer that sort of help to our neighbors, meaningful, unselfish service. And they experience the grace of God channeled through us. This is really our challenge. And this is how disciples are made.